First of all, a warm welcome to all. We're delighted to see so many of you come to this lecture, and delighted, of course, to have Tom Young to give the lecture. I'm James Watt, I'm chairman of the CBRL, and I was formerly ambassador in Lebanon many years ago, and that's why I first met Tom, and therefore know some of the context of his work. And I've also read about General Spears. We're very honoured to have in the audience with us Max Egremont, his biographer. And I think a lot of you, I'm guessing, know quite a bit about Spears already and about the period in which we're going to study today, we're going to look at today. It is fascinating. I think, in general terms, it has been ignored and even perhaps deliberately ignored in British public consciousness. To the extent that people look at the Second World War, they like to focus on glorious triumphs, or possibly glorious defeats like Dunkirk, but triumphs like El Alamein and the Normandy landings and so on, and general victory. What we don't like talking about is how we were at odds with the French, and sometimes in conflict with the French, who were at the time very important allies to us as we were to them. And so it's always a sensitive subject. And in looking at Edward Spears' role in Lebanon in these 4 or 5 years, we are going to be looking right into the heart of that relationship. Before I hand over to Tom, though, could I just say a quick word about the Council for British Research in the Levant, we are hosts this evening. We have an office here in the British Academy. We've been around for an awful long time. Our origins go back to the founding in 1919 of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, and we still have an institute in Jerusalem. We also have one in Jordan, in Amman. And over the last 15, 20 years, we've had to expand very willingly from merely doing archaeology and anthropology to doing the whole range of the social sciences and humanities and arts, with a contemporary as well as an ancient flavour. So we try to connect the distant past to the present, and we try to look at the whole range of human activity, human life, through our research, which is all postdoctoral research. So we facilitate postdoctoral research from British universities, but you don't have to be British to benefit from our scholarships and our fellowships. You merely have to come through the British university system. You're doing your PhD at a British university. So we're very proud to play this role. We're very proud to continually try to expand it, enrich it. And this evening, I think, is quite a landmark in that it's the first time we're taking a sort of political historical subject in the 20th century rather than some very distant past subject or some more sort of sociological subject. So I'm delighted to see the audience here this evening. I think you're all going to enjoy what Tom has to say. Tom, as many of you know, is an extremely successful and admired artist living in Beirut for many years now. And he's not simply a painter. You see examples of his painting here and at the back of the room as well, and in the brochure that he's provided at the back. But he's also somebody who creates more than installations. Actually, he takes spaces, ideally a historic house with a great past and a possibly slightly ruinous present, which he then tries to revive and to summon up the spirits and the ghosts, happy ghosts, let's say, of that building and of the period in which it thrived. And so to that extent, he's a remarkably sensitive and penetrating historian. He calls himself an archivist, which is absolutely right, but he understands history in a way which is very deeply felt, very deeply thought, and which he expresses both through his canvases and his installations, if you like, but also, happily for us this evening, through a lecture. So, with no more ado, one more ado, I've been asked to refer to the travel grant scheme that the CBRL has. We try to offer postgraduates, PhD students, the chance to travel to the region, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, historic Palestine, which we cover. And we are extremely grateful for the support of some very generous donors who've helped us with this. And we've always looked for a little more. So if any of you are feeling very generous this evening, there is a collection box at the back, and there's also ways of talking to us about other means of payment, if you feel like that. We'd be most grateful. So, with that, I'm going to hand over to Tom. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you very much, James Watts, the chairman for the British Council in the Levant, for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to that. I would also like to say that there are some of my paintings at the back there, and we're trying to raise funds for travel grants for research in the Levant. Now, if there are any paintings that take your fancy, I'm willing to give a percentage to that travel grant for postdoctorate students who want to go to the Levant. But yeah, we can talk about that later. Now, I'd also like to thank historians and writers who have helped me with this research. Max Egremont, who wrote the biography of Spears, is here with us tonight. Also, Philip Mansell, James Barr, the biographer of Spears's remarkable wife, Mary Borden. Jane Conway is here tonight, which is great. And also Lebanese historians, sadly not with us here tonight, Yusuf Mawad, Dr. Khaled Shbaro, Salem Oseiran, and the late Abbas Abu Saleh, who have helped me a lot, and the late Patrick Seeley. And we're also honoured this evening, I think, to have a relation of the Aylmer family, who I'm not quite sure, but related to Spears's godson, and very close to the Spears family and Mary Borden's descendants. Now, some of you may know me as an artist and not as a professional historian. However, today I will try my best to be the latter. I will be exploring a little-known shared history of Lebanon and Britain, how we perceive that history and what it means to us now. Now, this touches me personally because I love both places and am interested in an episode which bridges two seemingly disconnected places. Now, I think we probably all know that Britain has an extremely bad and damaging history in the Middle East, but the following episode may provide one rare positive moment when we actually did something good. Now, the subject of tonight, Edward Louis Spears, was born in France in August 1886. His English mother, Millicent Hack, seen here holding baby Louis Spears, suffered from severe mental illness, and this surely affected his troubled relationships with women throughout his life. Now, after his mother was put in a mental asylum and lately completely abandoned him, he was brought up by his grandmother, Lucy Hack, in Ireland, and notably also in France, in Provence, Burgundy, and Brittany. He grew up speaking perfect French, and in 1906 he became a young officer in the British Army for the 11th Royal Irish Hussars. Now, he became a liaison officer between Britain and France in the First World War, a role he really invented for himself, acting heroically and challenging leadership which he felt was often incompetent and terribly wasteful. His childhood and early career set him on a path which was to dominate his life, the struggle between Britain and France, both important parts of himself. He loved both countries, but never truly belonged to either. Now, why was Spears in Lebanon? In the beginning, it had nothing to do with any affection for the Lebanese. As ever, Lebanon was the unfortunate arena for other people's wars. In 1940, France had surrendered to Nazi Germany, and Marshal Pétain signed an armistice treaty with Hitler. The Nazi collaborators formed a government at Vichy, and as such, France's colonies, of which Lebanon and Syria were part, were now loyal to the Vichy and by extension the Nazi regimes. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, began using Lebanon as a place to land their planes and support Rashid Ali's insurgency in Iraq against the British, which, if successful, would threaten the whole of the Middle East and North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean campaigns because of one thing, that infamous natural resource, oil. Well, some things haven't changed. Spears wrote, apart from Britain itself, the Levant seemed to me to be the most important theatre in the world. We drew essential oil from Iraq and Persia. The pipeline to Haifa was of the greatest importance. But if the Germans were to gain control of the Levant states, we would have inevitably lost the Suez Canal and Egypt, which was within 1 hour's flight of the Lebanese and Syrian landing grounds. This would mean the loss of the whole Mediterranean. So Spears led a campaign with this gentleman, Charles de Gaulle. And here they are pictured dining together at the Ritz, just up the road from where we are today. And Spears had brought de Gaulle personally to London in his plane from Bordeaux as the Germans closed in, and persuaded the British to support this relatively unknown Frenchman. And he convinced Churchill and the British military command that the Allies must take Lebanon and Syria back from the Vichy and Nazi control. Eventually, the invasion, called Operation Exporter, happened in 1941. And after a vicious and absurd short war, which really amounted to a French civil war in the Levant, the British and the Free French took control of Lebanon and Syria. It infuriated Spears that the French fought more bravely against their own countrymen in Lebanon than they had fought against the Nazis in France. Importantly, the Free French promised independence to Lebanon and Syria, and this promise was guaranteed by Britain. Displaying a distinctly colonial attitude to establishing influence in the region, particularly as the British were unpopular in Palestine for obvious reasons, Spears wrote, "How do we secure the goodwill of the people? It seemed to me that the most obvious, as well as the simplest way to do this, is to promise them independence in a manner that would carry conviction, so that they would forget how often it had been promised before but always withheld." But whatever the reasons for independence were, in Spears's mind at least, a British promise meant something. He actually called British broken promises to the Arabs immoral and nasty. Spears was appointed head of the so-called Spears Mission to liaise between the Free French and Lebanese and Syrian puppet governments, and later became the newly created British Minister for the Levant. He took residence in this house, in Zarif in Beirut, and this became the British ambassador's residence from 1941 to 1982, and is now an administration centre for a social welfare institution, Dar al-Aytam al-Islamiyya. And Spears was accompanied by his wife, Lady Spears. Now, she is a remarkable person in her own right. Mary Borden, a prolific American novelist and pioneering nurse who had set up field hospitals for the French troops on the Western Front, as you see here, interestingly wearing stilettos. What she did those for at the Battle of the Somme, I'm not sure. And she then set up hospitals for free French troops in North Africa and Syria during World War II. Here she is on the left with our friend Charles de Gaulle, who we're going to hear about quite a lot more later. Earlier in her life, she had campaigned for the suffragette movement and actually had spent a week in Bow Street prison for throwing stones at the Treasury Department windows. Now, I will draw on her memoirs titled Journey Down a Blind Alley, which were published just a year after the war ended. As she had no political ambition, she perhaps recorded events a little less egotistically than her husband. And here she is, again, in her role as society hostess and successful novelist. Now, she loved Lebanon. In her memoirs, she wrote about her compulsion to paint there. I was in love with the land and the sky. I was in love with the wonderful, soft, full light that poured down round me and through me and seemed to fill not only my eyes with beauty, but my body with an essence that was life-giving and had something to do with the source of pure happiness. It wasn't just the landscape which captured her heart. She wrote about the Lebanese, these people are so much more like us than anyone in England imagines. Their Arabic names make them seem strange to those who don't know them. Now I feel that I do know many of them, and I find they have the same emotional reactions, the same ideas about decency that I have. They are gay, spontaneous, sensitive, and quick, where the British are solemn, phlegmatic, and have their sensibility under such control that they are about as vibrant as blocks of wood. Now, after the Allied invasion of Lebanon, the Spears took this house as their residence in Beirut, and here it is on the left, just after they left in the 1960s. And here it is last year during my exhibition in the same hallway. Now, since their time, and since the British left, it has been a centre for Dar al-Aytam, firstly as an orphanage during the civil war in Lebanon, and then as an admin centre. Now, I actually approached Dar al-Aytam in 2016 with an idea to do an exhibition there. I was given a lovely studio in the building, and here I am at work in what was probably the Spears' bedroom, because it has the best balcony in the house and has the best ensuite bathroom with many of its original features. So, in a way, working in that very place was so evocative and so inspiring that I felt I had to find out who these remarkable people were. What happened in this very building. Now, I painted and taught children from the orphanage there for 6 months. From 2016 to 17, and studied books about the most famous former residents. and it was an incredibly inspiring experience. And from the history that I discovered, I thought, really, I have to paint some portraits about this remarkable story that almost no one seems to know. So this is a installation of portraits of some of the most notable former residents and people who've lived and visited the building over the years. However, shortly before the exhibition opened, the portraits were removed by order of the director of the institution because the history was deemed as being too political and potentially controversial. I was told that the paintings may inflame French opinion on a diplomatic level, anger pro-French Christian politicians still in power to this day, and possibly attracts bad attention from more extreme Islamist and Syrian nationalist elements. Now this shows that the history is still alive. This is something that's very much with us now. And it's for the director to decide what is best. But I believe that people do deserve to know their history and be able to identify it with the place in which it happened. This is what really brings the history alive for people, particularly for children. And this is particularly relevant in Lebanon, where history is disputed and many of the places where important events happened are being demolished. This disrupts the development of a strong identity. An understanding of the remarkable story of how and where the modern country of Lebanon was born, however contentious and messy, I believe could help develop a stronger identity and a greater sense of self. Now, back to our friend Spears. Once he had settled in Beirut, Spears describes his first meeting with the French commander in the Levant, George Catrou, and the British commander, Jumbo Wilson, at the Sofa Grand Hotel. Now here's another painting from the house. And here is the Sofa Grand Hotel, which sadly is in a ruinous state. It's actually the site of my current projects to transform it into an arts and music venue later this year. But this is where they had their first meeting. And Spears writes, "The meeting between Wilson, Catrou and myself took place in the hotel garden. The atmosphere was somewhat strained." And I think this photograph tells you what that meeting must have been like. And it wasn't just the French command which was the target of his wrath. Showing his barely disguised contempt for the British commander, Jumbo Wilson, Spears writes, and here is Wilson, "He was an enormous bald man, active for his size, unexpectedly so, like an outsized child's balloon rising into space at the lightest touch. He had the good fortune to resemble a benevolent owl. Feathers alone were missing. But his physical characteristics were not a reliable guide to his character, and I personally never located the benevolence his wide paunch seemed to proclaim." In fact, the British Foreign Office were regular targets of Spears's, I think, sardonic venom. Now, over the next 3 years, Spears's view of the French began to change as he witnessed their dictatorial and exploitative measures against the Lebanese. His main aim became the thwarting of French power in the Levant and support for the nascent Lebanese and Syrian independence movements. Now Spears was also quite a good artist, and here is his caricature sketch of de Gaulle, which shows that he says a lot about what he thought of de Gaulle. Now, de Gaulle, painted here by me, his main aim was to restore the greatness of France and seemed to have no intention whatsoever of granting independence to Lebanon. This set him on a collision course with Spears. De Gaulle said to Foreign Office official Robin Hutchins, "It is we French who have given them their freedom. And it is for us alone to judge when they are fit to receive it." In no uncertain terms, de Gaulle wrote to General Catroux on the 1st of May 1942. He said, "You do not take any orders from a foreign general in any matter whatsoever." We all know what general he meant there. "In any case, persevere in your task of eliminating all British influence." It must have been hard for de Gaulle to give these orders, knowing that the existence of the Free French movement, at least at that time, depended entirely on British support. De Gaulle continues, "Spears sees the establishment of a democratic parliamentary regime in Lebanon as a weapon with which to dispossess us." Now, how interesting that the establishment of a liberal democracy in the Middle East was seen then as a destructive weapon. Spears was appalled by this attitude. He knew that it was mainly British and Australian soldiers who had defeated Vichy forces in 1941. He was also outraged that de Gaulle had kept many Vichy staff in control of Lebanon. Whilst his view of the French was deteriorating, what did he think of the Lebanese? Well, to begin with, he was equally escaping. In 1942, in a letter to the Foreign Office, he describes the pliant French stooge, President Naash, pictured here with Spears. There's Naash in the middle, and his so-called government. Spears writes, "The two native governments are hopelessly inefficient, especially the Lebanese. I've often likened people to chewed string in my time, but I never met an individual characteristic of that article until I met President Naash." But later, he was full of admiration and idealization, a sort of romantic fascination. Something had changed. He wrote, "The French could never have understood, still less accepted, that the Lebanese sprang from a far older and higher civilization than their own." He regarded them as shrewd, and I quote, "very clever people." This adulatory praise for one people, the Lebanese, could also turn the other way, as he showed really very racist attitudes towards Jews and Ghanaians later on in his life, which, despite being typical of the time, are nonetheless shocking. So what went on at the house? Well, there were political meetings, and here he is on the front steps of the house in 1942 with his wife Mary Borden there in the middle, and the British Minister for the whole Middle East, Dick Casey, on the right there. And here I am with Max Egremont, the biographer of Spears, in exactly the same place last year during my exhibition. Now, and here he is in the house in the main hallway where my exhibition was held. Now, from here, and in his office nearby, Spears orchestrated the fair distribution of wheat amongst rural areas to avoid the appalling famine that the Allies had caused in World War I, and also strangle attempts by rich landowners to push up the cost of wheat by hoarding supplies. So what Spears was doing was actually really working hard for the common man, the ordinary Lebanese villager. He also revitalized the Lebanese silk industry, reopening several deteriorating factories to make silk parachutes that were used in the D-Day landings for Allied armies. Now, have you ever wondered where that silk came from? Well, it was from Lebanon. Basically, he wanted to win the war, and he pursued any positive policy to this end. But even in 1942, he was worried and felt isolated. The American ambassador to Britain had called for his dismissal for fears he was supporting a local insurgent movement. In June 1942, the Foreign Secretary, Sir Anthony Eden, wrote to Churchill saying that Spears, I quote, does not possess the right temperament for what is primarily a diplomatic post. Now, we all saw, well, we didn't see, but Eden's handling of diplomatic handling in the Middle East was exposed rather badly in the Suez Crisis soon after that. Now, Spears was aware of his vulnerable position. He wrote to Harold Katia on the 8th of July 1942, "The one thing that really puzzles me is London, and I have a horrid feeling that the strong attitude which was the characteristic of our policy towards the Free French and the Levant has been somewhat modified. I should very much like to be reassured on this point, as nothing is more difficult and discouraging than the feeling one may not be enjoying the full backing of London." In another letter, Sir Arthur Cadogan wrote about Spears, "He is essentially an Arabist. His primary object is to carve out a position for himself." This allusion to his vanity is backed up by several sources. Another secret telegram states that most of Spears' staff regarded him as, I quote, "an ambitious and unscrupulous self-seeker." But Spears still held the trump card of his old friend Churchill's support. Now, at the National Archives, I found this letter written by Churchill, and in it you can see that he supports his old mate Spears, saying Spears is very capable of standing up to French pretensions. And he also regularly told Spears' enemies, "Louis Spears has a great many enemies, but he has one friend." Now, something which is clear from these plots to undermine Spears is that no one was considering the best interest of the Lebanese, apart from, it could be argued, Spears. His wife, Mary Borden, also did a lot to help the rural Lebanese and Syrians, setting up medical clinics to help the poor and the diseased. She wrote, "Syria and the Lebanon are dear to me. The people have become my friends, and there is more beauty in their country than in any other I have known." One wonders how they must have discussed their work in the house in Beirut to help the local people. Now, I recently met his private secretary, May Arida, who was 18 years old at the time, and she went on to be one of Lebanon's most famous and greatest beauties, as you see here. And she vouches for the man that she remembers as très charmant. She went on to become the famous president of the Baalbek Festival, world water skiing champion, and also competed at the Winter Olympics, and was friend of most European royalty. Spears had a colourful private life. Now, here he is in the garden in Beirut where I painted, and here he is with some Foreign Office officials and his mistress, the blonde lady there, Nancy Morris, who became his second wife later in life. There is much evidence in his wife's memoirs about how much this ménage à trois upsets her. Now, another woman who won Spears's affections was this lady, the well-known socialite beauty Maud Farjalla. In Samir Asir's seminal book Beirut, he describes Maud Farjalla as Spears's muse. In her memoirs, Visage d'une époque, she describes how Spears personally overturned the planned British occupation of her friend George Sider's mansion in Ras Beirut after she complained to him. Then she dined with him at Le Bain Militaire in Manara, and then at his residence in Zarif. She was given a guard of honour as she entered the house. Now, whatever their relationship was, it is clear that he had a great affection for her. Now, another woman who won his affections was the singer Asmahan. Spears was passionate about her. He wrote about this in his memoirs. She was, and will always be to me, one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen. Her eyes were immense, green as the colour of the sea you have to cross on the way to paradise. There are several references in Lady Spears's memoirs to dinners and cocktail parties at Asmahan's house. The singer also visited the British residence. Spears describes one notable incident. One night I was dining alone at the residence when the Arab butler informed me that the Emir Atrash, Asmahan's husband, wanted to see me urgently. Half an hour later he appeared at the residence. I asked my butler to what I owed the honour of this urgent call. He then explained that his wife had telephoned asking for his immediate presence at the embassy. So that was it. She required the absence of her husband for reasons best known to herself, with the consequence that both he and I had been fooled into providing her with time of which she no doubt made good use. Now, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that she was working for British intelligence, but also may have been working for the other side too. Now, whatever happened between Asmahan and Spears, we shall probably never know. But when she died in mysterious circumstances near Cairo in 1944, whilst shooting this film, which is called Gharam ou Inti'am, which means love and vengeance. Spears was overcome with grief and went to the place where she was killed to lay flowers. Now, back to the political affairs of Lebanon. At Spears's insistence, free elections were held in September 1943. Remember, this was a key moment in the war when the British really needed the Levantine Arabs on their side, because there was still a great fear that potentially the Arab population, particularly the Muslim population, might go to the German side. And Spears was determined to bring about the independence that Britain had promised Lebanon. Now, the British-backed constitutional bloc defeated the French-backed national bloc, and the new Lebanese government, with its presidents Bashar al-Khoury and Prime Minister Riyad al-Solih, pictured here in a portrait, which is actually at the end of the room, the real thing. The Lebanese then demanded full independence from France, and with Spears's backing, refused to attend the Armistice Day parade. After Helu, the new French minister, because Couture had been replaced, basically Helu had discovered that Lebanese deputies had not been invited to the Armistice Day parade. Rather, the Lebanese had discovered that. So El Solah and El Khouri, Spears's allies, Lebanese allies, refused to attend the French parade. Now, Spears had found genuine voices for independence in El Solah and El Khouri. The Lebanese independence movement wasn't new. In fact, Arab nationalism actually had its roots amongst Lebanese Christians who desired to be free from Ottoman Muslim power in the 19th century. And one of the most famous landmarks in modern-day Beirut is the Martyrs Monument, a sculpture honouring Lebanese nationalists hung by the Ottomans in 1916 after they found a list of Lebanese nationalists carelessly discarded by none other than George Picot of the Sykes-Picot map. Now, El Solah, the son of a Lebanese Sunni Muslim Ottoman civil servant, had been inspired by the notable Algerian freedom fighter Abdel Khadr and his own experience of being put on trial by the Ottomans. He had become a Lebanese nationalist after he abandoned the idea of a wider Syrian unity. El Solah campaigned for Arab independence for many years and had been imprisoned by the French for his support for workers' rights. The French Mandate government also sequestered his dear old childhood home on Beirut seafront, and then they sold it. The house was then demolished and replaced by apartment blocks. It broke his heart. Now, El Solah had meetings with German agents, but he soon realised that he could better use the British as an ally against the French colonial rule. In Spears, El Solah recognised a perfect partner. He, like other smart Lebanese politicians, knew that Spears was a vain man and cleverly exploited this. When El Solah was elected as Prime Minister, Spears wrote to Harold Macmillan, "He is undoubtedly the best man amongst a very limited number of Sunni Muslims available." As Spears knew he had to appeal to the Muslim community as a way to create a fairer, more equal Lebanon, which was not completely dominated by Christians. He knew that Lebanon would never work otherwise. Now, I've just discovered this photograph, which was sent to me by the grandson of Adel Oseiran, who was a leading Shiite notable, who Spears made very good friends with. In fact, there is Spears sporting a wonderful pair of shorts, which I gather was de rigueur amongst the British at the time. And here he is with the Shiite Muslim community. Now, it's very unlikely that you would find any member of the French colonial powers doing that. And this is Spears's, I think, remarkable achievement, was to make friends with not only the Christians but the Muslims too, and to see that actually Lebanon is a unique and remarkable place, but its success hinges really on the ability of those two communities to work together. And as we know, that still hasn't completely happened. But I think it really is worth revisiting the vision that Spears had about coexistence. Now, I had just come back from Lebanon, where I had dinner with Ali Oseiran in the pale jacket just to the left of Spears there. I had dinner in his house, and they told me this story. Now, a criticism often levelled at colonial powers is that they created weak states in order to continue dominating them. Now, this may be true in many cases, but from what I've discovered about Spears and his Lebanese allies, they were truly trying to create as fair a system as they could. Al-Sulh, in turn, knew how to keep Spears on his side, and met with Spears and his political officer Furlong every day. He wrote a note to Spears expecting to be backed up in a dispute with the French. Al-Sulh writes, "In carrying out the task I have undertaken, I am counting on the support of all the friends of Lebanon, of whom you are the very first." Al-Sulh and Bashar al-Khoury had formed a unique partnership of Christian and Muslim forces known as the National Pact. Now, religious division had been enshrined in Lebanese politics after a sectarian quota system was established in 1861 by, yeah, you've guessed it, Britain, France, and also Russia and the Ottomans, after Christian and Druze massacres on Mount Lebanon. Now, Al-Sulh and Oseiran ultimately wanted to transcend and abolish the confessional system, whereby people's identities and politics are defined by their religion. But to begin with, they knew they had to play the game in order to get into power. So a government was formed, which Al-Sulh felt was as fair as possible. Importantly, shortly before the elections, de Gaulle had replaced General Catroux, with whom Spears had developed an uneasy yet working relationship, with Jean Hiller. Now, Jean Hiller was the former Vichy ambassador to Turkey. Mary Borden describes this change as a calamity. Hiller had no grasp of the local situation. Spears describes him, I quote, as very undistinguished and a typical alcoholic. He made me think of an anteater because of his long nose, which, unlike that of the animal, was red at the tip, but seemed forever to be sniffing for something. Now, on the 10th of November, there was a dinner at the Spears residence. This is 1943. And the dinner was to host King Peter of Yugoslavia and Jean Hiller. Spears writes, I told Hiller that I would like to have a word with him. And here is the house again, where they were having dinner. The house was not very convenient for occasions such as this, Spears writes, with a large, barely furnished hall on the first floor, onto which gave two rather small drawing rooms, not very elegant. But I took Hiller aside into the right-hand room, which we called the green room. And there it is, on the right there. Now, would Hiller give him his word that there would be no precipitate French intervention in the recent formation of the Lebanese government? The delegate quickly assented. Je vous donne ma parole d'honneur. I give you my word of honour. Afterwards, May saw her husband's obvious relief. It did not last long. In the early hours of the morning of the 11th of November 1943, Spears awoke to find the eldest son of President El-Khoury in his bedroom. His face was covered in blood, and the boy said that soldiers had entered his parents' room, where his mother was ill in bed, and dragged his father off, also beating the boy with the butts of their rifles, shouting, "Son of a dog, son of an Englishman." The president had called out to him as he was carried off. "Go to General Spears and tell him." The French had arrested most of the Lebanese cabinet and imprisoned them in Rashaya Castle in the eastern Bekaa Valley. Now here is a photograph, and here is my painting of the same view. And that painting, incidentally, is at the end of the room here. Now, 3 ministers had managed to escape and set up a temporary de facto independent government in Basharmoun. And here they are, with a local sort of tribal fighters who I gather found the whole thing very exciting, and were very passionate to defend their country's so-called independence. And these ministers were assisted by these armed locals and a number of quite glamorous ladies. One of them is here, in fact. It is May Arida's mother, in the white, on the right there. Now, Spears writes from his residence, "It was now nearly 7 o'clock in the morning, and I telephoned Casey in Cairo and told him what had occurred. He just could not believe that the French had been so insane, and we both agreed that we must react immediately. As we spoke on the phone, Hiller's voice came on the radio, declaring that he had suspended the constitution, dismissed the government, and appointed Emil Edde head of a new government. Later that day, Spears invited Laure El Khouri, who is the wife of the Lebanese president who had just been imprisoned, and Spears invited her to come and stay in the residence, where he could give her protection. Spears writes, "My wife, Mary Borden, visited Madame Khouri, the wife of the president, that afternoon and found her terrified. Black Senegalese troops had previously killed several people outside the house who had formed part of a peaceful delegation. The long flight of steps outside the president's residence were running with blood when my wife arrived. Madame El Khouri implored to be given a British guard. But as this was impossible, I offered her and her children the hospitality of my house." So, Laura El Khouri and her children actually came to the British residence to stay. And very few Lebanese people know that. Now, Lady Spears describes how the house was like a railway station, the centre of activity and meetings about independence and what to do with the French attempted coup. Deputations poured in, among them the Maronite Archbishop of Beirut, the Muslim Grand Mufti, and a certain Madame Zalfa Shamoun, the wife of one of the Lebanese ministers, pro-British ministers locked up in prison. Spears describes her entrance to the residence that day. "In tripped Madame Shamoun, fair as a ripe wheat field in sunshine, her immense blue eyes ablaze, whose husband, the pro-British Camille Shamoun, had also been seized." The next day, both Spears and his wife were particularly inspired by a massive women's march, led by Zalfa Shamoun, in this portrait, of Christian and Muslim women, which took place on the streets of Beirut on the 12th of November, just down the hill from the house. Now, Spears writes about the Muslim women and, in fact, the whole march which took place. Here is a photograph, which is a still from British Pathé of that march. Spears writes, "They were saying that they were Lebanese women, just women who loved their country as much as did their Christian sisters, and they demanded freedom for their country and the release of their leaders. No more were they to be helots of an alien race. They were simply Lebanese demanding the freedom they had been promised. They marched to Spears's office, and I quote, "left me with the following message for the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill." The letter reads, "His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, we Lebanese ladies of different creeds strongly protest about the hideous aggression and treachery committed against the officials of our independent government and by the Allies, and regard this as an insult to our liberty which you protect and fight for. We ask your immediate intervention in the interests of safeguarding the rights of weak nations, which you have often declared to be their protectors." Signed, the Ladies of the Lebanon. Now, Riyad al-Sulah's daughter, Yusra, recalled how Spears told her, "A country that produced such splendid women deserved to be free." And Mary Borden also writes about the Ladies of the Lebanon movement. "What interests me most is the behaviour of the women," she writes. "It cost them something to go out into the streets and make a public spectacle of themselves. Nor could they know that the black Senegalese troops bearing down on them wouldn't shoot. I know they achieved one thing, and I believe that although the first fine frenzy has dwindled, it will last. They achieved national unity. They brought to birth a united spirit, and I do not think it will be easy to snuff out." Now, all this attention surely pressured Spears to act, to save the Lebanese, to be the liberator, and to bring about true independence. This was his moment of glory, and here he is looking very comfortable and rather pleased with himself, with his political friends. Now, one can only imagine how this must have played into Spears's vanity and desire to be thought of as the successor to Lawrence of Arabia. Now, the British establishment, however, were not impressed by his behaviour. Duff Cooper, the British ambassador to the Committee of French Liberation, and de Gaulle, had written to Churchill after a visit from May, Spears's wife. She and her husband believed that the main object of their mission is to maintain the rights of the native populations of the Levant against the dominant power, and even to encourage the natives to assert these rights. This is not my view, nor the view, I believe, of His Majesty's government. Now, for me, this is what makes Spears a compelling figure. Now, he could be, obviously, very vain, and he was certainly mixed up in the dirty rivalry between Britain and France, and affected an arrogant imperial heir, but he showed empathy and compassion for, I quote from him, "a small and defenceless people, the Lebanese." For a British general of the time, this was unheard of. On the 13th of November, matters got worse. French troops killed 11 peaceful protesters in Tripoli, in northern Lebanon. Peaceful protesters at the AUB were also fired upon. The crisis also came close to Spears's residence. He writes, "In Beirut, the French had kept the nearby Muslim quarter of Basta practically in a state of siege, not allowing the people to leave their houses. This led in many cases to a desperate shortage of food. The British Army commander told the French General de Lavalade that the French must distribute food, otherwise the British Army would do so. The French immediately complied." Now, the moment came to a head when Spears and his colleague Casey felt that they had to make an ultimatum to General Catroux, the commander of the French forces in the Levant. The letter they wrote reads as follows: "In the opinion of His Majesty's government, it is essential that the persons mentioned should be released and reinstated in the offices they held before the recent crisis caused by their imprisonment. If the President of the Republic and other Lebanese ministers have not been released at 10 a.m. on the 22nd of November, they will be set free by British troops." It is this letter which defines the date of Lebanese Independence Day. And here are the ministers just after their release because of Spears's threat. And I think this photograph is quite instructive, because you see Spears on the far left wearing the same white suits as the Lebanese ministers, whereas the French General Catroux is looking not exactly pleased in his uniform there. And here also is a sketch of the first flag of the Lebanese Republic, which was hurriedly created in the house of Sa'ib Salam. Now, he was a leading and up-and-coming Sunni politician at the time, and he and Henry Faraon met other members of the parliament, and they sketched this flag, and this flag is today still the flag of Lebanon. It was influenced heavily by the fact that Henry Faraon was the consulate to Austria, and they thought that they put a Lebanese flag as the national symbol in the middle of it, and do away with the rather French looking flag that Lebanon had before. And this information has been confirmed to me recently, in fact, because Sa'ib Salam was Spears's hunting partner, and these stories were told to me by the recent Prime Minister of Lebanon, Tamam Salam, who is the son of Sa'ib Salam. So that comes from a good source. Now that day in Martyrs Square in central Beirut, crowds celebrated independence, and that night there was a ball to celebrate independence. In Beirut, Spears spoke of freedom. "I am certain of little Lebanon's welcome among the noble company of those who have dared all for freedom, and who, refusing to accept defeat, are witnessing at last the dawn of the day of triumph, a victory won at the cost of such blood, many tears and great sacrifice." Stokes, Spears's deputy, wrote, "Everyone is hysterically happy, because for the first time in the history of Lebanon is united, Christian, Muslim and Druze. Spears is the absolute hero of the day, an inspiration in the struggle for freedom." But the British government were not so amused. Churchill sacked him. Now, Foreign Office reports from the time are littered with criticisms and plots to have Spears sacked. Government staff hated his unorthodox methods and vanity. A Foreign Office memo titled "How to Get Rid of Spears" was written only 2 months after Spears helped Lebanon become independent. Another note states, "I'm afraid there is no doubt Spears is a complete misfit." To stand up for the rights of a small nation was dangerous to the whole concept of empire, British and French alike. Churchill personally warned Spears, "We should discourage the throwing of stones, since we have greenhouses of our own, acres and acres of them." However, Churchill did give him the honour of at least appearing in public to have resigned. Churchill wrote to him in 1944, 3 months before he left Lebanon, "I had great difficulty in securing your return to your post. You did not take my advice to try to keep your Francophobia within reasonable bounds. I will, however, arrange that, when the time comes, you will be given the opportunity of asking to be relieved instead of being abruptly superseded. That is the best I can do." Now, Spears was also an anti-Zionist and argued with Churchill about the establishment of the State of Israel. He called British lies to the Arabs, I quote, "immoral and nasty." And despite the fact that his paternal grandparents were in fact Jewish from the Alsace region, he always denies that he had Jewish blood. However, his background made him the victim of anti-Semitism throughout his career. In 1947, he received a letter bomb from Zionist extremists, angry at his opposition to a Jewish state in Palestine. His habit of passing on interesting stamps onto his cousins who collected them saved him, because a close look at the parcel revealed the ominous wires. Now, his wife, Mary Borden, also had strong humanitarian views about what was happening in Palestine. In 1948, she was involved in setting up the Anglo-Arab Relief Fund to help Palestinian refugees. In a strongly worded letter of appeal, she warned that the troubled story of Palestine is not finished. What we are watching from our comfortable distance is not the end, but the beginning of a tragedy that is going to affect the history of the world. The attitude of both Spears and his wife cannot have done him any good with the British establishment. Churchill wrote to Spears on the 28th of January 1945, "It is not correct that you take a position which is hostile to the government by whom you are still, in effect, employed." About Lebanon and the French, Spears wrote, "By abandoning the idea that these people were their inferior slaves, and by treating them instead as human beings," the Lebanese, "the French quite soon established good relation with the Lebanon. Then at last I could say that the mission given to me by Churchill had been fulfilled." Now, you may well wonder, what was a British general doing deciding what should happen in Lebanon? What right did he have to be there in the first place? What were the British and the French doing competing for power in the Levant at all? Now, these are valid questions. There can be no doubt that the actions of these two countries did much damage. But I think we have to see Spears in the context of his time and consider the best parts of what he wanted, that no other people of another country should decide what happens to Lebanon in future apart from the Lebanese themselves. Whether he really meant this, or whether he really wanted just more British economic influence in the Levant, is open for debate. However, the notion, however idealistic, that Lebanon should be self-reliant is an important issue to reconsider now, because as we know, this dream still hasn't really come true. The struggle for Lebanese independence cost Spears both his comradeship with de Gaulle and his treasured friendship with Churchill. In the end, as D-Day approached, and due to British fears that France may actually fall to communists after the war, to keep the French on side was a far more important consideration in Churchill's mind than Little Lebanon. Spears lost his post. He was useful as a way to curry favour with the Lebanese in the heat of the moment, but once this had been achieved, he was discarded. After his dismissal, he returned to England with his diplomatic career in ruins, and then lost his seat as an MP at the next general election. He spent the rest of his life in business, actually as chairman of the Institute of Directors, which is just next door here, and also managing a gold mine called Ashanti in Ghana. But he never lost his love of Lebanon. He returned to Beirut to a hero's welcome in 1946 after the war, and regularly entertained Lebanese friends in London, regaling everyone about his wonderful achievements. When he died in 1974, he was buried in the village of Warfield in Berkshire, where he lived. And a delegation from the Lebanese government attended the funeral. Appropriately enough, there is a cedar of Lebanon in the churchyard. And mercifully, perhaps, he never saw the country which was the site of his greatest achievements get torn apart in a vicious civil war. And likewise, he never witnessed the other country he did so much for, Syria, also descend into the hell we are witnessing now. Now, we all love a hero, a maverick, who stands out from the crowd against many odds, struggling for what appears to be right, and in many ways fits the bill. In other ways, perhaps he doesn't. Was he a megalomaniac self-seeker? Was he really interested in the rights of the Lebanese? Was he just an accidental champion of Lebanese independence? Whether he meant it or not, his actions led to the first crack in the whole edifice of European colonialism. And after Lebanon, many other countries in the region and around the world also won their own struggles for independence. And this, I think, is his vital legacy. Now, he is buried next to his wife, Mary Borden, in Warfield. And in fact, her tombstone is the only one that mentions their very close ties to Lebanon. And his tombstone is in a very sad state. It's in fact falling over and really needs some attention. And they're actually buried as well with their only son, who died, in fact, before he did. And hopefully, this project might help perhaps get him a little more respect and get these graves, these tombstones seen to. Now, I think today's Lebanon would have both horrified and delighted Spears, and despite its dysfunctional sectarian system and environmental crisis, it remains a place of creative and relative political freedom, which is unique in the region. And I can tell you, it's a great place to be an artist. And miraculously, the war next door in Syria has not spread to Lebanon. Now, however we judge him, this extraordinary character, full of contradictions, who contributed significantly in both world wars to the Allied victories, provided vital support for the man who eventually created modern France, de Gaulle, and then did so much to win independence for Lebanon and Syria, is now largely forgotten by the British. He is only remembered in Beirut by the name of the street which is closest to the house where he lived. Now, few people in Lebanon know why the street has this name, or what momentous events happened in his house just up the hill near the street. His wife, Mary Borden, wrote at the time, using the nickname B for her husband, "What is to come of it all? This, Lebanon, is a backwater now. All the big issues are being decided elsewhere. No one at home is interested in the Arabs. B will get no thanks, whatever happens, for what he has done here. For many reasons, I think that should change. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I think all of us learnt a great deal. I think we all feel inspired by Tom's own inspiration for his subject and by the meticulous research he's done, the thoughtful comments he's supplied, and I think he's given us a lot to think about. Tom, would you be prepared to take one or two questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Run quite far into the period, we'll just take one or two. So, can we have... Is that all right? And we've got drinks next door, even better. So, not much to hold us back from the drinks, but a couple of quick questions would be great. Let's see one. Sit down.
You mentioned that Spears also did a lot of work for Syria.
Yeah.
Did he ever consider that the union of Syria and Lebanon would have been good?
Well, that is a very good question. The lines of independent Lebanon had in fact been drawn in 1920 by General Gouraud of the French, and I think he was just responding to the political reality on the ground at the time. It seemed that the Lebanese political system was already quite well developed in the 23 years or so since that decision. And also, importantly, some of the leading Lebanese Sunni politicians, Riyad al-Sulh, he changed from being a Syrian nationalist to being a Lebanese patriot when he could see that if the Christian forces were left to their own devices, the Sunni Muslims of the Lebanese, within Lebanese territory, would completely lose out. So it's a very complex matter, and it's in fact one of the reasons why Riyad al-Sulh is such a controversial person for the Sunni community and for the Syrians, and actually was the reason why he was assassinated in Jordan in 1951. So it was to do with internal Lebanese politics, and I think Spears was just responding to the reality at the time. Yeah, that's it.
So when did the
Sorry, could you practice the... Sorry, take the microphone.
So when did the French assume Lebanon?
As their sort of their territory. Well, it was decided in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 that a line famously was drawn in the sand, whereby the British would get everything south of that line and the French would get everything north, and Lebanon was north of that line. The French had had very strong ties to Lebanon that went back centuries, both religious ties, setting up foundations and universities and colleges and vineyards and also silk factories. There was a lot of business between the French and Lebanon. And today Lebanon has a very strong French character. You can see, I'm sure you noticed when you came out. So the French assumed that Lebanon would be theirs. And in fact, most Lebanese Christians wanted the French, in fact, to be their sort of colonial overlords. And in fact, many Lebanese Christians still want the French to be their colonial overlords, and amazingly wish they weren't independent. I've heard those voices expressed. There are very strong ties between France and and Lebanon, but not many people know that it was in fact the British, or a very unusual British individual, who actually won independence for Lebanon.
Thank you again, Tom. Thank you all for being here. Please come through and have a drink, and we'll continue to discuss this.